Okay, as always, starting out with gratitude, thanks to Alec for acting as engineer and producer, and to Patricia for composing the music. There's going to be a slide coming up in a little while that is so badly photoshopped, you'll also realize how much I rely on Alec as art director for this enterprise. Suffice it to say, my embarrassment will be clear when we get there. Okay, so as always, what I'm planning to do is to talk directly to you at the beginning and the end, and we have some slides to show you as well. And as always, we would love your comments and questions. We'll have a comment and question session at the end. You can absolutely use the hand up method then, or you can put your comments and questions in the chat and Alec will curate them, as they say. Anything else that I wanted to say before we start? No, I think that's just about it. All right, so without any more ados, let's start with the slideshow. Okay, so when I started the Endangered Alphabets project about 12 years ago, I got in touch with David Crystal, who many of you know is like the preeminent linguist, the author of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language, the author of Language Death, and about 100 other books on language. And he said something, he was very encouraging, he's a wonderful guy. And he said something very interesting about the Endangered Alphabets project, which of course, I'm not even sure I called the Endangered Alphabets project yet. He said, you know, a lot of people are studying language loss, but nobody is studying script loss. And that really astonished me. I assumed that as somebody who just kind of stumbled into this, there were doubtless, you know, lots of experts who were doing real research and had PhDs and all this kind of thing. And to my astonishment, he said, no, it's all on your shoulders. And I thought, really, this could scarcely be in worse hands. But over the last 12 years, I have given a lot of thought to script death and script birth. And as a result, today's talk is actually going to be a little more analytical and lecture-like than my usual talks, which, as you know, are full of off-the-cuff remarks and jokes and anecdotes and essentially guesses at the truth. And in this talk, I'm actually going to try and present a more substance where I know it, which of course is by no means everywhere. So yes. Because nobody is studying script loss, or there isn't even an academic discipline that looks at writing systems and endangerment, it means that there are a ton of questions that are not being answered or even considered right now. And here are some of those questions. For example, how are scripts lost? Are certain kinds of script more vulnerable than others? Or is it more that certain cultures or certain script usages are more vulnerable? Where do the threats come from? What are the effects of script loss? That is a really interesting and important one. How does the loss of its traditional writing system affect a culture, which is very similar to the previous question, in fact. And then the big one, which is, can the decline be slowed or even reversed? But along with these questions about script loss, it strikes me that there are a similar series of questions about script gain. which once again is something that is barely being studied or even acknowledged. How are scripts created? Who creates them? What are the necessary conditions for the adoption, usage, and survival of a new script? What is the effect on a culture, not of losing its old script, but of gaining a new one? And then why would someone go to the enormous time and trouble of creating a script for their people when they may not get thanked for their work? So really what we have today is 2 talks, each of which could easily be an hour, and I've jammed them into 1 hour, which means that there are some things that I'm not going to be talking about, even though they're utterly fascinating, such as the role of dreams in script creation. And the relationship between script loss and language loss, you know, all kinds of things like that. Okay, so here we go. So one of the great myths of language, which has been perpetuated up until remarkably recently, and frankly, a lot of people still believe it, is that languages just die. Or that scripts just die. And this is kind of similar to saying, oh, dodos just died. You know, they died because they were stupid or whatever. No, they died because people killed them. Simple as that. And this notion that scripts and languages have a kind of natural course of life. They're born, they flourish, they die, is complete nonsense. And I'm not really sure where that nonsense came from. In part, I think it may have been simply from ignorance because people weren't actually studying what happened. In part, I think it's because of this academic attitude that you should study things, but you shouldn't actually get involved. In part, I think it's because the people who destroy a script are the winners. They're the victors. They're the powerful ones. And therefore, you might not want to arouse their ire by pointing out that they just eradicated a script, a language, or an entire culture, which might kind of make them angry if you pointed that out, even if it's true. But the other thing is, going along with this, as I've said before many times, part of the problem is that if you simply look at standard history, history is, of course, written by the winners in the language and the alphabet of the winners. And what we draw from this is that scripts, like languages, do not just die. And we actually have some good, solid evidence of a number of scripts going out of usage. And some of them are forced out of usage over a long period of time. But in many cases, that extinction event is actually really swift and brutal. And so probably the most dramatic and swiftest example of a script extinction event was the destruction of pre-Columbian writing and symbol systems by the Spanish. So here we have part of what's called the Dresden Codex. So this is actually a book or a manuscript. It's called the Dresden Codex because that's where it ended up. But in fact, the story goes like this. As part of his campaign to eradicate pagan rites, Bishop Diego de Landa ordered an inquisition, which ended with an auto da fe in 1562. And essentially, he ordered his men to collect every piece of writing, a codex, or writings and symbols on more solid objects like stone, and have them destroyed or burned. Approximately 5,000 images were destroyed. only 3 and possibly fragments of a 4th survived. And the Mayan writing system, which was extraordinarily interesting and remarkably sophisticated, essentially became, it fell out of usage within 2 generations, partly because the people who practiced it had lost all their materials and were also probably involved in the auto-da-fe and quite likely burned. Partly because the practice of writing is something that needs to be passed on. And if the people who are largely responsible for it have either been killed or are too frightened to continue doing it, then it doesn't take long before that practice falls out of usage. Excuse me. What is also interesting about this example is the relationship between script eradication and religion. So the pretext that was used was that these were pagan images, that they weren't just pieces of informative writing, pieces of historical writing, although we'll come on to that in a minute as well. They were actively, in some way, supporting a pagan culture. And what is really interesting about that is that the relationship between scripts and religions is extremely close in many cases. The practice of writing has spread largely with religions or with armies, sometimes also with trade. And when a form of writing is intimately associated with a religion, while that religion is spreading and expanding, then obviously that script and the practice of writing that script also spread and expand, which is why you have the Syriac script being used in China, for example. But it also means that when that religion is persecuted or falls out of fashion or changes for other reasons, then the religion and its sort of expanded radius shrink, and the use of that script shrinks. And a good example of that is not only the Syriac script, but also the Avestan script used in Zoroastrianism. And that's also really true of, excuse me, very much true of shamanic scripts, which are used as part of shamanic practices, which especially over the last 100 years, tend to really have dwindled in usage. A great example being the Dongba script in China. So we're going to look now at my horrible piece of photoshopping. One day I will have to learn how to take an image in Photoshop and put like a circle around something. I don't know. So here we have a map, as you can see, of South Asia. And I've highlighted one country, namely Nepal, but also 3 states, Goa, Jharkhand, and Manipur. And I'm going to be referring to those over the course of the next few minutes. So try and, for those of you who are not from South Asia, as I know many of you are, try and memorize where they are. There won't be a quiz, but it just means you'll be able to picture it more clearly. So the relationship then between a script and a religion really can work against that script when things go bad for that religion. For example, in northeastern India, where you see Manipur there, the ancient Meitei-Mayak script was all but lost when Shantidas Gosai, a Hindu missionary, spread his religion in the region in 1709. So the king who converted decreed that Meitei-Mayak should be replaced by the Bengali script, which was more closely associated with that religion. And the result was this. So books and documents written in the Manipuri language in the Meitei-Mayak script were burned. And this was such a traumatic and catastrophic event in Manipuri history that in fact even today that day is remembered or noted sort of as a day of catastrophe or as a day of shame. Next slide, please. And here is an example of the Mite-Mayak script. But and obviously this is really kind of interesting to look at the script. And the sort of the mark on the top left corner, I fondly imagined to be a scorch mark, although in fact it probably isn't, and I have no idea what caused that mark. But one of the things I want to point out to you is what this manuscript is. So this is a Royal Chronicle of Manipur. So one of the great issues with a script being used to write important things, because basically writing is an act, it's a conscious act that we undertake when we think that something's important enough to record or to pass on or to send to somebody else. What that suggests, as I've said, because history is written in the winners and the alphabet the winners, when you have a change in leadership or ownership or governorship of a culture, the history of that culture may well immediately become vulnerable. And if that history is written in a particular script, that script may become vulnerable along with the history. So scripts are deeply visual representations of their cultures. They are culturally iconic. And the Mayan system is a great example because it is so robustly graphic and so deeply connected to a sense of place by being carved in stone, apart from being written. It must have seemed especially alien and especially threatening to the Spanish. And because it involves these graphic elements, it was particularly easy for them to think of writing as being connected to pagan images. But in fact, actually, lots of other much less graphic icons of a people's culture and history have been banned or destroyed throughout history. For example, the Amazigh people in Morocco, who have a script whose ancestors at least were 2,000 years old and is now somewhat in revival, the Tifinagh script. It is still not used on identity cards. So if you are Moroccan and you have an identity card, but you are Amazigh and you want to have your name in your script, you cannot. So it becomes another example of how history and identity and script are totally closely connected. Moving on. So here's another contemporary example. This is, of course, Genghis Khan. And as many of you know, the Endangered Alphabets Project has spent the last year trying to do something about the fact that the Chinese government is all but committed to eradicating the Mongol people within China as a self-regarding separate culture. And they've been doing that by a number of ways, including by introducing the Chinese script and the Chinese language in classrooms. But this is a particular example, a particularly interesting example, because it happened outside China. So about a year and a half ago, there was a large exhibition in France that was being planned and was being set up. And it was an exhibition about Genghis Khan, and it was identifying him as being the leader who essentially created the Mongol people, the Mongol nation, the Mongol Empire. And presumably some of the funding for this exhibition was coming from China, because the Chinese turned around and said to the curators of the museum, you may not use the following words in this exhibition. 1, Mongol. 2, Empire. 3 and 4, Genghis Khan. So it's clear that The Chinese are engaged right now in a process of rewriting history and erasing certain elements of history. And one of those elements is the Mongolian script. Meanwhile, as another example, in Nepal, use of the Nepalese script began to decline in 1769 with the Khokhali conquest of the Kathmandu Valley, and the new king began to eliminate use of Nepalese language and scripts in official purposes like administration and trade. When the Rana dynasty came to power, the script was completely replaced. And even as recently as 1941, writers and poets using Nepali script could be thrown in jail and their property could be confiscated. So it's another example close to book burning. So we now move southwest to Goa on the west coast of India. And this is the Goikanadi script. And we're about to see just a terrific example of the potency of writing and therefore the threat it represents by looking at the Goikanadi script, sometimes called Goya Kannadi, which was used in the Konkani community of Western India for writing Konkani and Goan Marathi. So Goa fell into Portuguese hands in the 16th century. And at first, the Portuguese priests, like many missionaries, were really interested in learning and studying the local languages and scripts so that they could better communicate with the locals. And of course, this was part of the process of trying to convert them. But as in South America, what happened quite soon was that the Portuguese branch of the Inquisition took over. And they made it an offense to be in possession of books in the local languages, and all books, whatever their subject matter, that were written in Konkani, Marathi, or Sanskrit were seized by the Inquisition and burned on the suspicion that they might deal with idolatry. Now, this probably included all kinds of non-religious, valuable works to do with art, literature, science, history, all those things. But they weren't concerned with that. Next slide, please. What I want to draw your attention to is that the order was that they be burned, whatever their subject matter. So we think of writing in terms of a vehicle for transmitting content. But the fact was, the Inquisition wasn't interested in content. They were interested in the fact that the writing represented and transmitted local identity, local sentiment. It was recognizably the writing of the people of that region, as opposed to the writing of their new Jesuit masters, the Portuguese. So what we're seeing then is that the very elements that make writing important and powerful and strong also make it a threat and make it vulnerable. It's really interesting also that despite this this edict that all works in local languages and local scripts be destroyed, Goikanadi continued to be used in a very, very sort of private fashion for centuries. Over the course of those centuries, more and more laws are brought into effect to suppress local languages and scripts. But nevertheless, the fact that Goikanadi survived, even in this vestigial sense, in the same way that, say, for example, the Baybayin script in the Philippines survived to the present day in a vestigial sense, despite the efforts of empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Spanish Empire. It shows that scripts do not just die. In fact, both of them put up a fight. They put up a tremendous fight, which went on for hundreds of years. And one of the interesting things about both Goikonadi and Babayan is that right now there are efforts being made to reintroduce or revitalize them. The Babayan script is actually at the center of a legal legislative efforts to revitalize and restore traditional scripts of the Philippines. There is a tremendously passionate debate happening on Twitter right now about the possibility of reintroducing, digitizing, and sort of revitalizing the Goikonadi script. So, and just to give it an answer to the question, is that possible? So in the 1990s, the governor of the province of Sunda, which is the western half of the island of Java, decided that they wanted a script that was theirs. And this is really, really important, that really represented their culture, their history, as distinct from the cultures and histories of other peoples throughout Indonesia, which is, 17,000 islands, I think it's 100 and something million people. It's large and complex, and to sort of compress it all into one national identity and one official language and one script, sooner or later, people are going to start saying, actually, we want our difference to be respected, not to mention our pride, our history, our separate cultures and traditions. Not that we've got anything against our neighbors, we just want to be recognized for who we are. And so a very interesting process was undertaken where a number of scholars and historians and writers and members of the public got together, and they looked at a whole series of possibilities. Shall we create a new script? Shall we use the Latin script? Shall we use the Arabic script, which has been used in this region in the past? And they decided that they were going to essentially pull out and dust off a script called Old Sundanese, which had not been used for 350 years at this point. And so they brought in graphic designers who created a kind of a modern look version of it. And this is the revived Sundanese script. Now, it isn't used very widely yet, but the fact that, first of all, the fact that it was possible because those documents still existed, and the fact that it was desirable because there was enough of a feeling that we are a people, we want our writing system, whatever it is, shows the enormous force that is at work here. And so we're going to move now from script death through script revival into script birth. Okay, so one of the interesting things about new scripts is that those of us in the Latin using world in the West, the notion of a new script, it doesn't really compute. If we were to say, if I were to say to people, what do you think that means? They would probably think I mean things like George Bernard Shaw's efforts to simplify the spelling of the English language, which isn't a new script at all. It's just the old script used differently. So we, first of all, as I've been saying throughout this talk, because we only use one script, we are uniquely unqualified to understand scripts. The people who use multiple scripts on a daily basis, such as people in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, etc., understand this perfectly. And secondly, we don't understand the need for a new script because it's inconceivable to us that our own script should ever be threatened or should need to be replaced in any way. I'm aware that I haven't yet said a great deal about one of the questions I asked at the beginning, which is, what is the effect on a culture of losing its script? And that's partly because I'm still trying to work out all of the ins and outs of that. But I will say that we can judge the effect on a culture of losing its script by looking at the reasons that other cultures have for creating one. So let's move on. So this is a map that I did not Photoshop at all, and as a result, all of the writing looks okay and there are no ugly squiggles. This is a map that identifies a region that I've mentioned before in this series that has been recently dubbed Zomia. And that's in part because of the Zo people, who are one of the many people who live in this area. So I was talking a little bit about Zomia last time, and about how this is this sort of mountainous upland region. It's not particularly hospitable, it's not particularly good farmland, and so consequently, it has become a region of refuge for people who are being pursued by, for example, the King of Burma, or the Emperor of China, or other military leaders who are driving them away from their ancestral homes. And so many of them, the Karen people, the Hmong people, the Chin people, wind up in various places in Zomia. Another thing that happens, and I won't go into this in detail, is that because they're scattered, it's not unusual for these cultures in refuge to be scattered into different valleys or different regions, and to actually either develop their own versions of their ancestral script, or to create new scripts for themselves in different areas, different scripts, which is a complexity we're not even going to get into today. We'll talk about that more in the 5th talk in this series. Okay, so in being driven from their homeland and losing that kind of stability and self-governance, a number of these cultures also lost writing. And so it's a really interesting question to say, what is it like to suffer that double loss of land and script? So we actually know, because in the 1820s, Karen villagers informed a Baptist missionary that God had given them writing on leather. By the way, they may well not have said God in the Christian sense. There are a number of illustrations of divine gift of writing, as I said last time, that have nothing to do with Christianity. So that God had given them writing on leather, but it had become lost. As again, I talked about last time. And since that tragic event, quote, "We have been an ignorant people, without books, without a king, without a government of our own, subject to other kings and other governments. We have been a nation of slaves, trodden underfoot by everybody like dogs." So the depth of shame and bitterness and anger, and the sense of multiple loss there, is extraordinarily powerful. And as we saw last time, it permeates even a number of cultural mythologies from this region, where their loss of script has become part of their cultural narrative of loss and desolation. But it's so interesting here to see this juxtaposition: without books, comma, without a king. So that's how closely those two are associated. And in a way, this is the dark side of the equation that is often used, which is that that if writing is a sign of an important development in the progress of human civilization, then conversely, people without writing are uncivilized. And that has been used by colonial and regional authorities for centuries as a way of justifying dealing with people in a contemptuous and savage way. They don't have writing, they're not civilized, they just deserve to be treated like dogs. And as these poor villagers say, we have been trodden underfoot by everybody like dogs. But this sense of loss and this tremendous passion about the connection between their misfortune and their lack of writing has led, especially in this region, to the creation of new scripts. So here is here's a sort of a fascinating one. This is all this is more stuff from Piers Kelly, by the way. This is an absolutely great article. Piers Kelly is the Indiana Jones of linguistic anthropology. He actually goes out in the field and meets the people and sees the ancestral scripts. So this is about the inventor of one of many indigenously created Karen scripts. And his name was Commodam, however that was pronounced. Of course, I don't know anything about this. Commodam received the miraculous script after going into involuntary trances. As I say, I'm not even going to have time to go into trance scripts and dream scripts, even though they are absolutely fascinating and really common, widespread. It is said that he would repeat a sound, presumably in this trance, again and again, until its corresponding symbol manifested itself on the bare skin of his chest. And just in case that sounds just ridiculous to you, don't forget that this may be a culture, for example, that uses tattooing. So the notion of designs appearing on skin may not actually be that unusual. An attendant scribe copied it out. This is actually another example of a person going into a trance and receiving, so to speak, writing, but not being literate and needing somebody else to actually then write down and compose these various symbols. An attendant scribe copied it out and waited for the next sound to appear. These sessions left Commodam exhausted, and he would sometimes sleep through the following day. Though Commodam was to proclaim himself alternatively king of the Chum or sky god of the Chum, he was by no means one of a kind. Here we go. At the turn of the century, the Bolivian plateau hosted multiple short-lived revolts by self-styled messiahs that were referred to as Fumi Bun, maybe, literally men with merit. In 1902, Commodam was merely one among more than 100 such competing holy men. The majority of these micro-movements either fizzled out or were defeated militarily, but Commodam and a handful of others would rally their followers to lead a unified revolt of the southern highland groups that lasted several decades. So a couple of language things I want to point out. Short-lived revolts by self-styled messiahs. that language is a little disparaging. What is going on here is a trifecta of creation that is quite common in Zomia, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, which is the simultaneous or perhaps congruent invention of a new form of writing, a new form of government, and a new religion. So bearing in mind that these are peoples who have been kicked around by everybody like dogs, they've lost everything, etc. These are all necessary conditions for self-invention or self-reinvention. And it's astonishing how common it is that the script and often a messianic religion based around the charisma of the individual and a new form of self-government emerge at the same time. And of course, in this account, this business of fizzled out or were defeated militarily, as soon as these movements achieved any kind of dignity or pride or identity or numbers, they became a threat to whoever was governing that particular area. And we're going to see in just a minute what that would lead to. But certainly Commandant was, in the end, was killed for being a leader of his people, and for being a leader of his people by creating a writing system. So the most celebrated of all of the script creation charismatic leaders of the region was Shonglue Yang of the Hmong people. New slide, please. So in 1959, so this is all pretty recent, an unlettered Hmong farmer and basket maker named Shonglue Yang announced that he had been inspired by God in a series of visions. So once again, it's another of these inspiration, dream, vision scripts to create a written language for the Hmong. As those of you who saw last week's talk know, the Hmong may well have had ancestral homelands further north. They may well have had writing systems, but they were driven south and scattered by the Chinese, and were living in a number of regions in these different Southeast Asian countries as subsistence farmers, typically very poor, typically viewed with some suspicion by their neighbors, especially as they practice their own forms of spiritual practice, but they typically did not use writing. And so what Shonglue Yang had done was, like Sequoia of the Cherokee, he'd set about converting first himself and then his people from non-literacy to literacy. And as with the Cherokee, the effect of his invention was rapid and radical, another sign of the importance of writing. Almost at once, he took on a messianic status for the Hmong. His followers called him Mother of Writing and looked to him for ethical and religious teaching and advice, even predictions of the future. So again, what we see is the reuniting and galvanizing of a despised people around a religion and a writing. So again, it's that trifecta. And here, in fact, is one of my carvings of the script that he created. It's one of a number of scripts, possibly as many as 8, that have been created by the Hmong in different countries at different times. And again, it's a sign that script creation is part of the process of trying to find self-respect, trying to find a sense of mutual community, trying to connect with those values that were lost, way back in the mists of history. And of course, because Shonglue Yang was so successful in galvanizing the Hmong and raising their sense of dignity and self-respect, he became a threat. He fled Vietnam after being arrested and jailed there for a while. He wound up in Laos, and in 1972 or 73, the government of Laos sent soldiers to assassinate him. Again, what we're seeing in that is the power of writing as a cultural force, and the fact that that power also therefore becomes a threat, and it becomes a vulnerability. And what is really interesting is that, and this is something that I don't believe has been published or written about anywhere else, is that the reasons for creating new scripts in Africa, which is where new scripts have been documented for 200 years, and South Asia, that the reasons for creating those scripts are often linked to the question, who is the oppressor? And the answer to that question not only affects the reasons for creating the script, but actually it also affects the purposes of the script, and even the look of the script. So we're going to turn to Africa now for a while. So in Africa, in many of the scripts that have been created over the last couple of hundred years, are implicitly or explicitly intended to be indigenous rather than colonial. This is explicitly stated by the creator or co-creator of the Luo Lakeside script. So it was developed by Kefa Ombewa in Kenya with help from a graphic designer and excuse me, Will Weir and Paul Sidandi of Botswana. It was invented specifically as a unique non-Latin way to write the Doluo language. And so as Kefa Ombewa said, to decolonize African culture. So who is the oppressor? The oppressor is the colonist, whether it be English, French, Arabic. I was interested in making sure that African societies, in this case, particularly Luo, also have their own script. Now, notice that he's talking in plural, African societies. He says, I want to make it an African script. If the Luo want to enjoy the script and own it, I don't mind, but it is an African script. I envision an Africa that is de-Latinized all the way from West Africa to East Africa. So a couple of really interesting things about this. One, the idea that the script should be indigenous rather than colonial. But two, the idea that because the whole continent has suffered from colonialism, the script should attempt to redress that. And so a number of scripts that have been created in Africa, their creators have explicitly said that their hope or intention is that not that they should simply represent one language, but they should be pan-African. They should be usable by all Africans for all African languages, which when you think about it, is an extraordinary linguistic diversity and a huge ambition. So that is, here is an example of the Luo Lakeside script. And already you can see that although in some respects we recognize those as letters, those of us who use the Latin alphabet, already they're doing certain things that are a little different. And this is the next thing I want to point out about script creation, is that when somebody creates a new script for their society, and their ambitions, especially in Africa, are that the script should be really of that society or that region or that culture, rather than, in some sense, an imitation of the colonial script. It also means that the look of the script becomes really different. And it begins to start pushing away from our Western assumptions of what writing is supposed to look like. So very few scripts are as indigenous in their design as the Berea script for the Zagawa people of Sudan and Chad. So the Zagawa people live in an extremely arid region. Camels are extremely important to them. And so their camel rearing, camel racing, even camel beauty contest culture. And so it seems entirely suitable that this script, first of all, should have been created in its initial form by a vet. And then secondly, that the letter forms should actually be based on branding marks. So we're used to, in the West, especially in the West of the West, we're used to seeing, cattle brands on cows, to denote ownership. So in this region, they put them on the neck of the camel. But as you can see, the uniformity of the letter width and the shapes are actually ideal for the sort of the metal end of the brand. So it's like the opposite of a cursive script. It's not intended to be something where a hand is moving and drawing the eye of the reader from one letter to the next. Each letter is individually stamped with like a sizzle and the smell of scorched hair. But there's another script that goes even further away from in challenging our assumptions as to what a script ought to look like. And that's the Mandombe script. So this, again, it's a script revealed in a sacred or spiritual vision or trance. And instead of being based on the movement of the human hand, which is, how we think of writing, this is actually based on the shapes of bricks in a brick wall. So it turns out that after waking from this dream and after thinking about, how am I going to go about creating a script that represents the language, the language, but also the spiritual beliefs of my people, his eye falls on a brick wall. And it just so happens that two of the shapes that turn up in the mortar in a brick wall, if you look right in the middle, there's a shape that looks a bit like a 2 and a shape that looks a little bit like a 5. Those are seen as being sacred shapes. And as a result, everything grows out from there, literally. And so you have a script that is extremely difficult to digitize and to print because there is no consistent letter height. So in so many ways, then, what you've got is a decolonized script creation here, where so many of the assumptions that the colonizers, including me, of course, as a Brit, have about writing are being thrown out. And instead, the sense of what should the script be like, what should it look like, how should it function, what should its symbols be based on, are drawn from the immediate surroundings. In this case, the brick wall. In other cases, in Bamun, which we talked about last time and in the first talk, we have symbols that are brought from local, say, for example, ceramic design. So there is a sense then that the script itself is rooted in the traditions and culture of its use community. Okay, so in South Asia, on the other hand, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong, I don't know of a single script that has been created in order to defy a colonial authority, even though obviously, British India covered most of that region. I don't know of a single kind of anti-British script. And likewise, I don't know of a single script that's been created with the ambition of being a pan-Indian or pan-South Asian script. Instead, in South Asia, you have a much stronger understanding and belief in the relationship between one's community and its script and its language. And these tend to be intensely local. And so the oppressor in South Asia is less likely to be the colonial authority and is much more likely to be the more powerful tribe, group, people, nation living next door who've been despising you for being illiterate, or as they say in South Asia, tribal. And so I did a little bit of counting. And can we move on to the next slide? And what I did was to look at new script creation in terms of place, but also in terms of time. So what you'll see then is that if we take the elsewhere category at the extreme right-hand end, so this is everywhere apart from Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, There's actually a trend against creating new scripts for one's people, probably because elsewhere the Latin or Arabic scripts or Cyrillic have been so dominant, or obviously Chinese, Japanese. So the number of scripts created elsewhere in the world before 1950 and since 1950 has actually gone down. And by the way, these numbers are probably not exact. So in my research for my Red List project, which is still ongoing, we are still finding new scripts that are coming up literally every week. So, but these numbers are a fairly reasonable guide. So in Southeast Asia, that's the second column from the right, we see that new script creation it sort of remains fairly consistent, although the number of scripts created before 1950 in Southeast Asia is probably larger because we simply don't know of all of the scripts that were created by the Hmong or by the Karen people or other peoples in Zomia in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There are probably more. If we look at Africa and South Asia, though, what we see then is that in Africa, we know of roughly 21 scripts created before 1950, 31 since 1950. So there's some growth. But if you look at South Asia, we know of roughly 5 scripts created before 1950. And these are ones where we actually know the author. We know that this person did it at this particular time. But since 1950, 47, and that number, as I say, has probably gone up since I made this slide just a few weeks ago. So the real growth center for script creation right now is South Asia. And in South Asia, the opponent also is, ironically, compared to Africa, the pan-Indian movement towards establishing the Hindu religion as a national religion, the Devanagari script as the national script. You know, there are voices that call for that. But in response to that, what we have is a very passionate regional and local movement that says, no, we want to do the opposite. We want to represent the true history, for example, of the people in the region of Goa. We want to make sure that our language, which has been sidelined, is revived. We want to make sure that we have our own script, even if it's one that hasn't been used widely for centuries. And more power to them, I say. One last point about script creation and script loss. Much of the study of writing has happened on a purely typological basis, and so considers writing in strictly technical terms and says, you know, that if a script fails, therefore, there must be something technically wrong with it. It must not like meet the needs of its language community. As we've already seen, that is by no means the case. Likewise, in new script creation, you could certainly say, well, there are technical reasons for a script being more usable than others. And one that's often given is it shouldn't have this massive character set of 6,000 characters because it'll be hard to learn. But you know what? Chinese has 6,000 characters and people seem to learn that okay. So the conditions for success of a new script are actually less likely to be technical. One, is there valuable content available in the script? So when the Barry brothers created the Adlam script, one of the first things they did was to write articles and books in the script that contained useful information. So that there had to be a reason for people to learn the script so that they could get that useful information that wasn't available elsewhere. Is it driven by the charisma of its author? So we've seen a number of charismatic scripts. The problem with those is that when the author dies or is killed, then that particular drive may be lost. Is it being taught well and accessibly? I know of scripts that are being taught through WhatsApp groups or through Facebook groups. Likewise, I know scripts that are being taught with a piece of chalk and a blackboard. The more organized the teaching, the more likely the script is to survive, which leads into the next one. Does the local or regional authority endorse it? So Mowgli Lookout, who created the Osage script for the Osage people, said to me, you know, one of the most important features in its success was the fact that the tribal council was behind it from the beginning, and say, yeah, this is something that we want to make happen. We regard it as being a vital part of our renaissance as a native people. Does the community feel they need a script? This is also always a tricky one, because there are some people who feel we don't want to go through all of the trouble of learning a new script, while there are other people who are kind of going, you know, no, this is what we need to establish ourselves as individuals. Likewise, it's very common, especially in Africa, I would say, for those in authority to say a new script is not going to be respected on the world stage. Our children need to be educated in French or in English so that they can go to school at the Sorbonne, you know, or the London School of Economics. If they speak their local language, they're not going to be taken seriously. If they write in their local script, where are they going to get their research published? And so there's, as I say, within the community, there is very, very often a division of opinion. And then finally, can it be digitized? This is a bit less of an issue than it may seem, but there are some scripts that are in fact extremely hard to digitize. So finally, some good news and some bad news in the reverse order. The bad news is that, as I've said, creating a script which brings together a people and enhances their sense of purpose and value may well create a threat. We know of at least 4 people who have been killed for creating a script for their people. And if you go to endangeredalphabets.com and you click on the blog, there's a blog post called "Another Script Author Murdered," which talks about that. But here's the good news. And for this, we're going to go back to South Asia. So while I was working on all of this, I got a message through Twitter, I think, from one of my spies in India. And he sent me a photograph of a mother language school, a local, very, very local community school in Jharkhand in India, which is very much a hotbed of script creation, as is much of northeastern India. And if we can look at the last slide here. So if you look right in the middle, it says the medium of education is English, Khurukh, and Hindi. And they're using the Tolong Siki script, which is a relatively recently created script for the Khurukh language. And this message, he sent me this photograph, and the message with it was, we can take it from here. That's the spirit. Okay, so the final thing I need to say, as I said to you before for my other talks, is that I strongly implore you to support our current Kickstarter campaign. It is the single most important funding source for the Endangered Alphabets. If we had not run Kickstarter campaigns for the last 11 years, we would not be in business. I would not be giving you this talk. I would not be doing this research. This would all be largely still unknown. I cannot stress enough how significant this campaign and all these campaigns are to the survival of the endangered alphabets. If you can't afford to make a donation, and heaven knows, I certainly understand that, I'm going to send everybody who's registered for this talk an email which has the link to the video recording of the talk, thanks to Alec. I'm going to send a link to registering for the next talk, but I'm going to send the link to our Kickstarter campaign. And If, as I say, you don't have the means to support us, which I certainly understand, you absolutely can help, because you can send that link to people you know who maybe can support us. And you can say to them, this is really important stuff. This is really important work. If you can support this Kickstarter campaign, it will make a huge difference. Okay, so I will now stop yakking at you, and I will take questions. And needless to say, we're already getting a bunch of stuff in from Biswa, who knows way more about this subject than I do. But Alec, I'm going to put you in charge of questions and comments, and ask you to sort of pass them on as you usually do.
Yes, there is a bunch from him. Cookborough script Kolama also lost. It has the same type of history. Tripuri king adopted Hinduism and rewrote all the docs and manuscript in Bengali. So.
Yes. So we actually thought we had come across somebody who was actually still using the Cockburrock script. Not actually in Tripura, but across the border in Bangladesh. But it turned out that it wasn't at all clear that that's what he was doing. He was claiming that that's what he was doing, but this definitely remains a kind of an open question. And if anybody has any information or any more information about anybody who is actually using or trying to revive the Cockburrock script, Koloma, then please send it in to me. Okay, what else?
Koi Kannadi is a cursive version of Kannada script. Sorry if I'm mangling all these pronunciations.
That's okay. I don't know how to pronounce them either.
Koi Kannadi stands for Canadian Script of Goa.
Yes. Yep. And that's all part of this. As I say, there's this passionate discussion taking place on Twitter right now, which includes not only Biswa, but also Anshuman Pandey, who is basically the person who has opened the door between South Asian scripts and Unicode. He's just a remarkable person, and sometimes it feels as if he has visited every village in South Asia to research and explore their scripts. And to get him involved in that conversation means that something may actually happen. So Anshu, if you're listening, no, you're not listening. Oh, well, I said nice things about you. Okay.
There's a gentle reminder that I mangled the pronunciation.
If you did, I probably did too.
Walter chimed in when you were talking about missionaries converting folks, that nowadays it's an institute with a benign sounding name.
Exactly.
That is doing great evil, I'm assuming. SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics, sends missionaries to learn a people's language in order to translate the Catholic Bible and use it to try to convert them. Yes,
one of the great two-edged swords in world language is that much, possibly even most of the research in world languages has been done by missionaries. And we wouldn't have, when I say we in the West, we wouldn't have information about, for example, the grammar, the syntax, the structure, the usage of many of these languages, had it not been for missionaries that went there to study them and paid, in many cases, in very, very diligent attention to languages. However, as Walter says, for those who believe in the importance of indigenous culture as opposed to imported culture, the reason for that study was to create biblical materials and to convert them. And SIL is, in fact, in some respects, the largest and most influential language organization in the world. So, as I say, it's a mixed bag.
And they only work during the summer?
I think they would, I think, and I could be wrong, they would have gatherings, meetings. So people would, presumably missionaries, lay people, etc., would come together and study language as part of like a summer school. I believe that's what it was.
There's a good question from David. I'm going to inject my own very peripheral question first.
Okay.
That's why I was looking at the new scripts that you were posting. Many of them look to me like they should go right to left. I don't know why I thought that, but is there a rhyme or reason as to when a new script decides to go right to left or left to right or up and down?
Typically, the new scripts that go right to left are ones who are created by people who learned Arabic. So they were in, like the Barry brothers, for example, who were growing up in a region where the dominant colonial influence was a Muslim influence and an Arabic influence. And so Adlam goes from right to left. Luo, I can't remember. That they're from a much more Anglo-British area of East Africa. So I would be surprised if it goes from right to left, but I don't know for sure.
Maybe. Depends on how much they wanted to rebel, right?
Yes, exactly.
All right. So David asks, is anyone inventing a character-based script, or are all new scripts alphabetic or syllabic?
That's a terrific question. So most new scripts that I'm aware of are alphabetic or syllabic, but there is this script that's being created by a guy in Ecuador called Juan Casca, I think. Is he in Ecuador or Bolivia? Might be Bolivia. So he's working on a script called Syllabario Amazonico. So it's a syllabary for the languages of the Amazon. So in that sense, excuse me, it is syllabic, but he's also a graphic designer, and the graphic design of the letters is really beautiful, and it looks kind of Mayan. I highly recommend you look it up. We actually have a blog post about it again on endangeredalphabets.com. And it manages to be both a relatively simple and syllabic form, while at the same time, if you see a group of text or a chunk of text in it, you kind of go, whoa, that looks sort of Mayan to me. But as far as I know, the influence actually tends to go the other way. So there's some people who are taking the Nsibidi system from West Africa, which is absolutely not alphabetic or syllabic, and sort of taking some of the features of those characters and using a more alpha-syllabic, using them to create a somewhat more alpha-syllabic system that's obviously dependent or based on it. So yeah, the movement, given that everybody is thinking, especially people who are younger than me, are thinking about their phones and about digitizing stuff, the movement tends to be much more what can we create that can actually be used on a phone so that we can communicate with other people in our culture without having to go through a dominant script, a colonial script. I'll take one more question.
Well, Walter chimes in, say Juan Casco is from Ecuador.
Thank you. Walter should know. He interviewed him, I think.
There's a couple of informational comments, no real questions. Oh, wait, here's something. Circling back to orientation, is there any explanation to why scripts are predominantly left to right and top to bottom?
Yes, so, okay, so my age is showing here now. I came across a script that's actually bottom to top. It's not by any means widely used script, but I cannot remember which one it is now. And I was absolutely delighted. Boustrophedon style. So many of you know this already, but boustrophedon is a Greek word meaning ox turning. And so this is a style where the writer would go one way across the page and then turn and come back like an ox plowing a field. And we know of a couple of boustrophedon scripts or scripts that have been boustrophedon at some point. I don't know anybody who's creating a boustrophedon script right now, except maybe, and this would be cool, for as a conscript, you know, something for fiction or for TV or for films. It would certainly be very, very cool to have somebody creating, oh, I don't know, a Rongo Rongo script. I think Rongo Rongo may be boustrophedon, although that's tricky because, of course, it hasn't been fully deciphered. But all of this stuff is just, all of which, this just goes to say how cool this stuff is, and also how much that I still have to learn before I can actually say anything really definitive. So I think we need to wind this up now. Thank you so much for joining us. Expect an email with all of this, all of these valuable links. And as I say, even if you yourself feel that you can't contribute even a couple of dollars to our campaign, please promote it to your friends or through social media or through Facebook groups. As I say, we would not be here. This work would not be happening. This discussion would not be happening if it weren't for our Kickstarter campaigns in the past. And I have to ask you to respect that. Okay, we are done. See you next week. Oh, one last thing before I forget. As I mentioned last time, this business of the discussion of revitalizing traditional scripts and protecting the fragile new scripts coming into play, especially in South Asia, is so current that I'm going to add a 6th talk at the end of this series, except it's not going to be me talking. It's going to be, I'm going to invite some guests, including Biswa, to talk about what conditions are going to be valuable or even necessary for the reintegration of traditional scripts that have become minoritized, or to help incubate new scripts as they emerge. And oh yes, admin of a large linguistics Facebook page, 100,000 people. I'd love to share your Kickstarter link. Yes, that's what we like. Wonderful. Okay, thanks again, everybody. I've enjoyed it. See you next time.